Okay, so since it's 12:01, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Abigail Andrews, and I'm the director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UCSD. And this session is co-hosted by a coalition of UCs, including UC Davis, UCLA, and UC Berkeley, the migration centers at those various campuses. And we're really excited today to have our speaker, Cecilia Márquez, who is the Hunt Family Assistant Professor in History at Duke University. Her research focuses on the history of Latinx people in the U.S. South, including looking at the formation of Latinx identity, Latinx social movements, and the importance of the region in shaping Latinx identity. And today she'll be talking about her book, Making the Latino South, A History of Racial Formation. So thank you so much for joining us, Cecilia. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. We're off to a great start. I haven't even muted myself yet by accident. Hi, everyone. My name is Cecilia Márquez, and I am so excited to get to be with you today. I feel like whenever I give my talks about this book, I end up California and Texas, end up on the wrong side of this. I'm always like, this isn't a story about California and Texas. This is a totally different kind of, it's like, that's how I always talk about it. So it's funny to actually get to talk about it with the West Coast, even if I'm here on the East Coast. So yeah, I'm gonna just mostly talk to you a little bit today about my book, how I came to the work, what the book is about, and what I'm arguing in the book. And then we'll open it up for questions. And I'm excited to hear what you all think. So I will get started. So I started this project actually started when I was a junior in college. I was at Swarthmore College, which is right outside of Philadelphia. And a group of us went to Shaw University, which is an HBCU here in Raleigh, just down the street from where I currently live, where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, was having their 50th anniversary conference. And for those who don't know, SNCC was one of the youth-led vanguard organizations of the civil rights movement. And they were gathering at Shaw University to celebrate their 50th anniversary. And we went down there in part to collect oral histories. So I was taking this class on Black women in the civil rights movement, and I got to go down and talk to people and interview folks. And it was this really special moment. And one of the people I met while I was there was this man named Luis Zapata. And I met him on the last day, and he was a Chicano organizer who had been living in California, organizing with the United Farm Workers, and come to Mississippi to work with the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union, which was an arm of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I got to talk to him for a little while, and I was sort of shocked because I just didn't know that there were Latinos involved in the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And I got to end up talking to him and a few other folks who were involved in the movement. And from there, I decided to go to grad school to study the history of Latinos in the South more broadly. And that's really how I came to the project, was through the civil rights movement and through social movements and an interest in how Latinos fit into that bigger Southern history. So my project goes from the 1940s to the 2010s. It moves chronologically through the second half of the 20th century. It examines how the racial position of Latino people in the United States South changed over time. It includes places like Georgia, North and South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Washington, D.C. And it shows how non-Black Latino people went from being racialized as what I call provisionally white before the 1970s to hardworking immigrants in the early 1990s, and eventually being cast as illegal aliens in the post 9/11 period. And whenever I say illegal aliens, I'm using scare quotes, so I'll let you sort of associate that every time so I don't have to do it. I think what people often ask is, what about Texas and Florida? How are those places involved? I'm really interested in historicizing new destination locations in the South, those parts of the South that saw rapid demographic change between the 1980s and the 2000s, places that had really small Latino populations before the 1970s, but then continued to grow over the second half of the 20th century. So you can see here from a Pew report, Among the top 10 fastest growing Hispanic destinations between 2010 and 2011, many of them, most of them, are below the Mason-Dixon line. And that demographic change will continue in the 1990s, the 2000s to today. By focusing on these communities, these new destination communities, as some social scientists have called them, I'm able to focus on these moments of encounter, how race was being actively renegotiated in the absence of a longer Latino history of a region. So somewhere like California, somewhere like Texas, Florida, there's a really long history of Latinos in those places. And I wanted to look at places where there wasn't that history of Latino settlement, Latino community, Latino presence, and see what happens when Latinos start to show up. How do other Southerners make sense of this population? So why do we care about the South? Why does this history matter? I think that this chart tells us one of those things, which is that if we want to understand the history and the contemporary stakes of Latino migration, the South is one place to look. The South remains one of the fastest growing sites of Latino migration and has, as a result, become an important site of Latino immigration, or Latino settlement, I should say, in the United States. So it's an important place to think and write about Latinos, despite the fact that it is really underrepresented in scholarship on immigration. So I opened the book with, or sorry, let me zoom back for a second. So I want to talk a little bit about what I found in my book. What are my big arguments, the big ideas that I'm working with? So the first big argument that I make is where and when you are Latino shapes what that means. This feels sort of like a potentially obvious thing, but one that is worth proving time and again, especially because so many of our dominant narratives about Latino history and Latino settlement have been established in places like California, Texas, New York, Florida. Where and when you are Latino shapes what that means. So what do I mean by that? I opened the book with the story of the Soto family, who left San Antonio, Texas in the late 1950s and moved to Rosedale, Mississippi in search of better jobs and a better life. In Texas, Daniel Soto, the family patriarch, couldn't find work as an electrician, a fact that he attributed to him being Mexican. When his wife's sister suggested that they relocate to Mississippi, they decided to take the risk and go. The Soto family quickly found better paying and steady work in Rosedale, Mississippi. Their daughter Mary was able to find friends among her white peers, and in contrast with Texas, the Soto family found a new kind of racial acceptance in Mississippi. Quote, "People were very nice, very sweet, very friendly, very helpful," Daniel's wife Alice Soto remembered. "We didn't feel like outsiders at all." The Sotos first confronted Mississippi's Jim Crow laws in a restaurant. Their daughter Mary described the experience, quote, "Coming from Texas, we were used to not mingling. You knew where you belonged and you didn't cross the line." Because of their time in Texas, the Sotos initially used quote unquote colored entrances. In Mississippi, they were immediately redirected to white entrances by Black and white patrons alike. Alice Soto remembered, quote, "The Black side sent us to the white side. We didn't even know why," end quote. When she asked, they said, quote, "This is the Black side. You go to the white side." In the 300-mile sojourn east, the Soto family had gone from using Mexican or colored facilities in Texas to white ones in Mississippi. This was not because Mississippi of the 1960s was a more racially progressive place than somewhere like Texas. Instead, it was because race worked differently in a place like Mississippi. The second big argument that I make is that we can't talk about Latino-ness without talking about Blackness. In the South, I find that Latino-ness is always defined in relation to Blackness. It is part of the reason that throughout this book, I try to be careful and to say Black or non-Black Latino, because what I find is that the experience of Latinos is fractured around this question of race and Blackness. That is to say, Black Latinos had a very different experience of race than non-Black Latinos. So we could take the story of someone like Manuel Aguirre, who came to the South as part of his service in the military in World War II. He remembered he saw something he had, quote, "never seen before. You couldn't sit no places," he recalled. "Whites and blacks, everything whites and blacks. I went in with the whites. I wasn't black," end quote. In his retelling, he chose to use white accommodations, not because he identified as white, he was Mexican American, but because he was not black. Take instead the story of Bob de Leon, an Afro-Puerto Rican from New York stationed in Georgia. One day he was running late to catch a plane in Columbus, Georgia, and he ran into a bathroom without paying attention to the Jim Crow signage. Apparently, he had entered a white bathroom and was followed in by a state trooper who loomed over him as he relieved himself. De Leon responded to the state trooper's intimidation by saying, quote, "You see something you like?" End quote. As the state trooper reached for his gun, one of the petty officers came in and retrieved De Leon to get on the plane. In Aguirre's story, he clarifies that he chose a white entrance because he wasn't Black. In De Leon's story, there was no question about where he would ultimately fit. His Latino-ness was unimportant in questions about his race. The Aguirre and Soto family had access to what I call provisional whiteness. So what do I mean by that term? One example comes from Elizabeth Batista Martinez, whom some of you might know. She was a sort of a famous civil rights activist, was a SNCC worker, and she features heavily in my third chapter, but also a founding sort of Chicana feminist activist. She grew up in Washington, D.C., and while she was in D.C., she remembered a white girl in her neighborhood being forbidden from playing with her because she was Mexican. People would sort of look at me, she remembered. Students in her elementary class would ask her, "Are you Hawaiian or something?" So part of what I talk about with someone like Martinez is that she's able to live in white neighborhoods, attend white schools, but still experiences forms of exclusion. This idea of provisional whiteness is that there's exclusion happening within institutions of whiteness. She's living in a white neighborhood, attending white schools, but still experiencing marginalization. And so it's kind of trying to account for the fact that many non-Black Latinos were able to reap in the South, were able to reap the material benefits of whiteness while still experiencing meaningful racial exclusion. That's sort of what I'm thinking about with provisional whiteness. Another example of this category of provisional whiteness comes from my own institution, Duke University. In 1943, when Juan Rivera applied to Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, administrators found themselves at an impasse trying to classify the Puerto Rican applicant. Dr. Joseph Robert, the assistant dean of the graduate school, responded to concerns about Rivera's race, noting, quote, "When it comes to the man and his color, I do not know whether or not he is white. You can obviously see," he continued, "that he is not entirely so. His skin is dark," end quote. However, Roberts noted that, quote, "Sometimes their type has been accepted in the South as dark Spaniards." Despite his dark skin and what they described as his, quote, "lively hair," Rivera was admitted to Duke. So again, it's a story about the ability to access white institutions, like, for example, a Jim Crow institution like Duke University, while also experiencing exclusion and marginalization. So I really lay this idea of provisional whiteness out in my first 3 chapters. The first chapter looks at Latino people in the 1940s Washington, D.C. It focuses primarily on the story of Carla Rosal Galarza, a girl who's the daughter of Ernesto Galarza, the sort of famous farm labor organizer of the 1940s, 30s, and 40s. She was kicked out of a, quote, colored vocational school for not being Black. And it really sort of uses her story as a way to look at DC in the 1940s in general, which is a Jim Crow city, deeply Southern in a lot of ways, and is also experiencing a massive change after World War II. When the United States wins World War II, all of these countries start to sort of flock to the United States to build things like embassies. So a bunch of Latin American countries that previously didn't have a large embassy presence in the South, or sorry, in the United States, all of a sudden have embassies. And so the question of what do these ambassadors and the staff of these embassies do in a Jim Crow city? So it's kind of looking at this emerging international group of folks, specifically from Latin America in DC, and how DC's Jim Crow order navigates them. The second chapter looks at south of the border, which is may not resonate as much for folks in California, but if you grew up in the East Coast or in the South, you are perhaps more acquainted with it. It's still alive today. It is a Mexican-themed road stop, which was opened in 1949 and situated between North and South Carolina. And it looks at specifically how most of the book is about actual Latinos. This chapter is about white people's fantasies about Latinos. So it looks at how white Southerners used and transformed national scripts about Latino-ness as a way to negotiate their own anxieties about swelling activism across the Southeast in what would become the civil rights movement and ultimately end Jim Crow. You will not be surprised to find out that Latinos were not involved in the creation of these images that you see here. It's created actually by a Jewish entrepreneur in South Carolina named Alan Schaefer. So part of what I'm looking at in this chapter is specifically south of the border, which again, for those who don't know, you can think of it as like a roadside Disneyland that's Mexican themed, like a super racist Disneyland is the vibe. And what happens is in 1961, as part of the Civil War centennial, they decide to open Confederate land at south of the border. And I'm interested in sort of what this tells us about white fantasies about Latinos and Latino loyalty and connection and things like that. Because in addition to Confederate land, sorry, I should say Pedro was a central part of Confederate land. You can see in the image here, Fort Pedro. There's images of him. And I should also clarify, Pedro is the Mickey Mouse of this place. He's the mascot. There's no actual Pedro person. He's a sort of an image that's used throughout this site. This is those images there are of Pedro. And he ends up in a Confederate uniform in a lot of their materials and things like that. And so writing about Latino identity and how white folks are fantasizing about Latinos in the South. Chapter 3 looks at Latino activists who traveled south to participate in the Southern Civil Rights Movement. The chapter shows that in the Deep South of the 1960s, in a moment when war was being waged over the future of race, Latino communities were being sorted based on whether they were black or not black. This meant that non-Black Latino people occupied a fraught and eventually contested space in Southern civil rights organizing as the movement became increasingly focused on Black self-determination over the course of the late 1960s. So this chapter looks specifically at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the story of the expulsion of whites from that civil rights organization, along with white activists who are expelled from the group in 1967. Non-Black Latinos are also expelled in the process. And so I write about what that tells us about meanings of Latinidad and race and identity in the Southeast during the civil rights movement. So these first 3 chapters are really putting together this argument about provisional whiteness, the importance of Blackness and non-Blackness, and the kind of sorting mechanism of Latinos and Latino identity in the South at this time. And then chapter 4 is really an important pivot point in this historical narrative. It's in the post-civil rights movement era that Latino people first emerge as a cohesive non-white racial group and move from being seen as provisionally white to racially other when they become Hispanic. So when we think about Latino history, a lot of times we think about the 40s, 50s, 60s as critical moments and kind of a coalescence of Hispanic identity, Latino identity, Chicano identity, these different sort of important moments in community development. In the South, it's a much later story. That timeline doesn't really show up until about the 1980s. There's a sense of actual Hispanicness or Hispanic identity shows up a lot later than it does in other countries. So what happens? In the 1980s and the 1990s, a bunch of things happen that result in the rapid increase of Latino immigration to the South. So it's a confluence of factors, including the South's growing manufacturing and food processing sectors. So while manufacturing is shrinking in other parts of the country or being sent abroad, it's actually growing in the Southeast in the 80s and 90s. Many of these industries were growing super quickly and outpaced the ability of local labor to fill the gap. Other times, these industries were just using immigration as a way to depress wages and working conditions. So they actually, the question of like, was there a labor shortage, I think is a really interesting historical question about the 1990s and Latinos. Some argue, yes, these industries were growing very rapidly. They needed labor. It's part of the reason they recruited Latinos. Others make the argument that these labor shortages are in fact sort of socially constructed as a way to make the case for recruiting labor and to push out US-born labor. There's reasonable people disagree about this, I think. But regardless, they start to look to Latinos and Mexicans and Mexican Americans in particular as a way to fill that labor gap. So in addition to the sort of expanding manufacturing sectors, there's also economic decline in Mexico at this time, which is happening at the same time of the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA. I know you didn't expect Ronald Reagan to make an appearance here, but he's arrived. So IRCA passes in 1986, and it does a couple things for those who don't know. It gives amnesty to nearly 3 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Many used their now normalized status as a way to leave urban centers that they had been sort of feeling trapped in for many years because it was a place that they knew and a place that they knew they could work and reliably live safely, relatively safely. And they moved to rural areas in the South, in part because it was a place they could buy homes, a place that they could raise their children away from the city, and in part because a lot of them grew up in rural parts of Latin America, and Southwest Georgia looked more like Guatemala, frankly, than parts of LA, And so people looking for peace, that's one of the things I heard over and over when talking to people, is that one of the reasons they came to the South was for peace and quiet, basically, which is very funny as someone who left New York City for Durham, North Carolina. I was like, whew, I am with you. Um, so at the same time that that 3 million undocumented immigrants were given amnesty, the IRCA also dramatically militarized the border. It made it harder to cross. It made it more dangerous to cross. It resulted in an increase in border patrol, militarization, hyper securitization of the border in a way that it hadn't been previously. So in an earlier period, many folks would sort of cyclically migrate. They would come for a season, return back to Mexico, come for a season, return back to Mexico. And IRCA really forced folks to make a decision. It became increasingly expensive and increasingly dangerous to cross the border. And so many people who had been engaged in this kind of seasonal migration all of a sudden brought their families from Mexico and settled more permanently in the United States. And a lot of those folks landed in the South. So why the South? We talked a little bit about the sort of expanding sectors, but the other important part of the story is the very active recruitment of these industries to bring in Latinos. So they experiment with a lot of really different strategies. They look to Texas, they look to Florida. They're basically trying to recruit US-born Latinos with some success. But they ultimately look towards Mexico. They put up billboards, for example, in Tijuana, Mexico. There's a billboard that says we have sort of images of, it says mucho trabajo in Russellville, Alabama. There's lots of work in Russellville, Alabama. They run these industries, which is mostly things like poultry, construction, carpet, furniture, some agriculture. They're running Spanish language ads in Mexican newspapers and US newspapers. They're running Spanish language radio ads. They're creating incentive programs to recruit fellow Latinos. So the important thing here, right, is that there's these big kind of economic changes happening, growth in manufacturing sector, changes in immigration policy. It is also true that these industries very actively sought out Latino labor. So in chapter 4, I look specifically at Dalton, Georgia, which is where these images are from. In Dalton, Georgia, which I'm sure no one in this room knows, because why would you, is the carpet capital of the world in the 1990s. Roughly 2/3 of all US carpet is created in Dalton in the 1990s. So if you've ever had to carpet your home, which I had to do recently, you've interacted with Dalton, Georgia. And so in the 1980s and 1990s, there's this massive effort to recruit Latinos to Dalton to work in the carpet industry. And part of what I look at in this chapter is trying to understand why in the 1990s, when things like Prop 187 in California are starting to show up and anti-immigrant sentiment is really growing in other places, is it possible that Latinos are landing in Dalton, Georgia, and finding relative acceptance, right? There's bilingual education programs that are started by, in part, the carpet industry. There's a real effort. This kind of, I think, complicated image of this man in the center is Erwin Mitchell, a Georgia state senator who helped start a bilingual education program in the Dalton public schools. I'm looking at that, and part of what I argue is that the carpet industry and several industries in the South in the 1990s were really invested in creating this category of the hardworking Hispanic. And so it looks at this chapter 4 looks at this bilingual education program called the Georgia Project, which recruited teachers from Monterrey, Mexico, to support the Latino population in Dalton's public schools. So part of the argument that I'm making in this chapter is that these racial categories, like when Latinos become Latino in the South, or is partly as a way to serve the needs of political and economic elites. Prior to the 1970s and 1980s, Latinos, with some exceptions, just didn't make up a large part of the workforce in the region. Prior to the 1980s, it's really Black and white labor that is fueling the Southern economy. And so managing Black labor becomes particularly important. But as Latinos emerge on the scene as a more important part of the workforce, so too do ideas about race. That is to say that ideas about race are coalescing at the moment that Latinos become an important part of the Southern workforce. When carpet industry desperately needed Latino labor, they were seen as hardworking Hispanics. They were celebrated as the lifeblood of these areas. Um, they were cast as hardworking, family-oriented people who could work twice as hard as their non-Latino Black or white counterparts. This quote that is the chapter, the I Love My Mexicans, this is from a Dalton, one of the managers at one of the textile mills. And this is really a lot of the language that they use. They talked about how hardworking they were, how they were the lifeblood of Dalton, how they saved this rural Southern community and infused it with energy and infused it with labor and basically built up this industry. That's the way they're talking about Latino immigration in the 1990s in a place like Georgia. The question, of course, I think remains if Latinos were in fact hardworking or if they were able to be worked hard as a result of their oftentimes vulnerable citizenship and economic status. However, in the 1980s and the 1990s, Latinos lost the privileges of provisional whiteness. However, this moment was also characterized by the veneer of a positive welcome. Racialized by their employers as hardworking Hispanic immigrants, Latino migrants began to lay claim to their new Southern home as they also embraced and extended the category of hardworking. Things change in the 2000s, and that's the subject of my last chapter. Chapter 5 represents yet another moment of transformation as perceptions of Latino people changed from hardworking immigrants to quote unquote illegal aliens. So this chapter looks at the first two waves of anti-immigrant legislation enacted in the South to show how race changed for Latino communities in 2001 after September 11th and again during the Great Recession of 2008. I argue that the xenophobia and massive expansion of the surveillance state after 9/11 laid the ideological and technological groundwork for scapegoating Latino immigrants in the years after the Great Recession as, quote, illegal aliens. Part of the argument that I'm making, or part of the importance, I think, of the book and ending it where I do is thinking about this kind of constant history. I'm just wrapping up teaching Intro to Latino History, and so it feels very fresh on my mind. But this constant history of invitation and expulsion that is sort of central to the story of Latinos in the United States. And really, the story of the South brings that home in a pretty profound way. The same Latino immigrants who are brought to Dalton, Georgia, actively recruited, actively sought out, recruited as part of incentive programs through radio ads, all of these different things, who were actively sought out and brought to Dalton, Georgia, were all of a sudden targets of some of the harshest anti-immigrant state level legislation in a place like Georgia. So Georgia passes HB 56, which is, I think in 2012, they passed HB 56, which bans undocumented students from attending the top 5 public universities in Georgia. So the kids of those immigrants who came to Georgia to work in those carpet industries are now banned from those top 5 universities. So while the story of race and racial formation in the South for Latinos ends on kind of a hard note, or at least for my story, it obviously continues on. It is also during these years that Latinos are continuing to grow and deepen their ties in the South. We start to see, when we think about someone like Natalia Molina's Placemakers, her article about placemakers in California, we see Latinos emerging as placemakers in the South in this time period. The opening of stores, of restaurants, of dance clubs, of community centers, of nonprofit organizations, of activist groups. This is really a time where Latinos are starting to this anti-immigrant legislation, in addition, is also part of the fuel that starts to really cement Latino identity in the South in a way that is similar to other earlier periods of Latino migration. So, part of the big arc of the book is trying to understand how we go from the Soto family in the 1960s coming to Mississippi and finding a warm and welcoming place to 50 years later, Mississippi being home to some of the harshest state level anti-immigrant legislation, understanding how race changed so dramatically for Latinos in the second half of the 20th century, and how Latinos, unlike other groups, lost their privileges to whiteness. This is a time when groups are becoming white, and it doesn't work for Latinos in the same way, although we can certainly complicate that story and think more about that in the Q&A. So what I think is important when I give this talk, I've given versions of this talk a lot in the South. And so what I think is important to share is that Latinos are not new to the South, that we've been here for a long time and we will continue to be here in the future. Importantly, that means that Latinos get to claim the South. The way that Latinos have sort of undeniably shaped the sort of history and future of a place like California, we can say the same about somewhere like North Carolina. Latinos are Southern and the South is Latino. So at the same time, our understanding the history of Latinos in relation to Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, also means that those of us who are non-Black Latinos, at the same time that we claim the South, also must reckon with our own history of benefiting from Southern white supremacy. Southern history is ours too, and as a result, we must be accountable to that history. By way of conclusion, I'll read a paragraph that ends the introduction to my book. The history of Latino people offers a new and complex way of understanding the history of race in the South. Latino populations were victims of, participants in, and on the front lines of fighting white supremacy throughout the history of the U.S. South. Latino people were implicated in all parts of Southern history, both radical and racist. They were fighting Jim Crow, they were benefiting from Jim Crow. They were profiting from Sunbelt expansion, and they were being exploited by the growing food processing and manufacturing sectors in the region. It is not a monolithic past, and it is one that refuses simple narratives about race. Rather, it is a more tangled web of alignments and realignments with racial categories in the region. Latino people have all of these Southern legacies and get to choose which legacies we want to mobilize as we imagine our Southern futures. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. This is a really, really interesting book and talk. So we will go ahead and open up the floor for questions. If you want to just use the raise hand function, or you can turn on your camera and just raise your actual hand. Yeah, let's jump in. Since people are being shy, I can go ahead and start. And I think kind of the obvious thing on everyone's mind is kind of the where is this going next question. Yeah. And you know, do you think that sort of the story that you're telling about the early 2000s is still happening and intensifying? Do you think there's actually a different dynamic going on right now with this sort of resurgence of white supremacy that seems, at least from my vantage point in San Diego, to be, you know, very prevalent in the South? Yeah, could you reflect a little bit on sort of, you know, what are the shifts that you think are happening from the time period you looked at into the present? Or is this more of a sort of deepening of the latter phase?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will tell you, so my next book project that I'm currently working on is about Latino conservatives and the history of Latino conservatives. So I feel very like in my brain about this current election. And so I won't say a lot about it because it feels, I don't know, we all need to have a good winter break. So I don't want to be the bad vibes. What I will say is that in the South, I think a few things are happening. One is if I continued this book 15, 20 years, the story would be about Central American migration. The story would be about indigenous migration. Increasingly in a place like North Carolina, we have a lot of folks who are like Maya immigrants, folks who, folks coming from places like El Salvador and Nicaragua. Like that's really, I think, the new population. And one of the things I don't get into in this talk, but is true, is that when I look at that Dalton chapter, right, there's like the first wave of Latino immigrants, and then every subsequent wave, there's angst about how the newcomers are like messing it up for everyone. like the newcomers, they didn't come the right way, or they're involved in gangs, or they're not hardworking. And that, I think, there's this kind of internal tension in Latino communities about this concept of newcomers. And I think we see how some of that has played out politically for us as a constituency, in the ways that xenophobia, nativism, mobilized by the right, has appealed to some Latino populations, in part as a result of that. And I think some of that is still existing in the South. That being said, I think the more hopeful story is that Latinos are also running for office. Like, there's more elected officials in the South than we've had before, running for local office. We had someone run for state office but didn't win this year. But there is a growing sense that Latinos are a permanent part of the South, and are a constituency that needs to be sort of understood and not catered to, but like sort of that we're here, kind of, we're not we're not leaving. And so there's a deepening of nonprofit organizations, connections with elected officials and things like that, that I think represent sort of a hopeful direction, that Latinos are increasingly organized and have a kind of organized presence in the South. I think there was a lot of hope that the demographic shifts in the South would lead to some kind of political realignment. And I think in part, what I see as a part, connected to my work, which is that Latinos are often entangled in and aligned with white supremacist ideas too, and that we aren't a population that is, if we think about Latin America, like that's a place that has a long history of white supremacy. And so this idea that Latinos were going to be inherently disruptive, I think, is part of what I'm challenging too. I think there's this idea that Latinos are disruptive to the black-white binary and to sort of traditional political paradigms in the South. And in fact, we can be very flexible, when you need to survive and when you need to adjust, and it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Okay, other questions or comments, or Monique, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm sorry, I can't turn on my camera, but this is really great. And what you were just saying reminded me of, because my work is on Florida, and I was thinking about, the Cuban positionality in terms of whiteness and in relations to Latinidad and things like that. But I know that there's been a lot of work coming out of thinking about North Carolina and Latinx folks, and some of this work has seen Latinx folks and African Americans coming together in terms of coalition, not necessarily political coalition, but even just, living in similar places and having, some overlap in terms of that. Whereas other researchers have found that there's a little bit of a split, particularly among working class Latinx folks and African Americans. So I was curious what your thoughts were in terms of, these kind of possibilities for these two groups coming together.
Yeah, there's a great book for those interested in Latinos in the South called The Browning of the New South by Jennifer Jones. She's a sociologist. And she's her dissertation was more about North Carolina. But her work is, I think, sort of central to my thinking, at least, about this, which is about how in some places there's a sense of linked fate with African Americans, and in other places there's a sense of kind of competition and scarcity and things like that. And I will say, it seems sort of, I don't know if I feel like I have a good generalizable answer. Like, it seems kind of community specific. And it seems in part based on the willingness and openness of leadership of both communities to she talks, for example, about in Mississippi. So Mississippi tries, sorry, let me try this again. Arizona passes SB 1070 in 2010, right? It's like at that point, this really harsh anti-immigrant legislation. And then my chapter 5 is looking at how Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, Alabama all try to pass their harsher version of SB 1070. Mississippi tries and fails to pass one of these laws. And part of the reason is because leaders of the kind of Black political class, the NAACP, the state level, like sort of congressional Black caucus version of that, really aligned with immigrant rights and Latino rights groups and become a kind of coalitional force that fights this law successfully. And then there's other places where there's less appetite for that kind of coalition building. And I think in North Carolina, it seems very specific to the like area, to the kind of agricultural regime. I mean, even in somewhere like Georgia, Dalton, Georgia is a place where Latinos get a very warm welcome. There's other parts of Georgia where they don't get as warm of a welcome, right? It's a really complicated thing that has a lot to do, I think, with local industry and again, kind of like what civil rights, the sort of legacy leaders of civil rights organizations think about immigrants and how they talk about immigrants. So a place like Durham, it's complicated. It's like really, it is really complicated in a place like Durham, a place that used to be a majority Black city. And there is this kind of sense, I think, from some Latinos, sort of emerging Latino political, I wouldn't say elites, but like future elites, this sense that there needs to be political Latino representation. And the sense sometimes is that it's like this kind of zero-sum logic of like, if we need seats at the table and those seats need to come from Black people, right? And I think that's this kind of logic that I think a lot of people are trying to sort of push back against and trying to sort of think of sort of new paths around kind of this identity, this kind of like really simplistic identity politics of like, we need a seat at the table, and if we get one, they can't, this kind of idea. But yeah, so I think I feel like I just gave you like 10 examples of why it's really complicated, because I wouldn't say that there's like a cohesive sense, but I do think that there's like a tension, and I think that there's a tension that is kind of well earned, right? I think that non-Black Latinos have there's like whole books written about the anti-Black racism within that community, and that we have to really reckon with that. And it's a real challenge with building community with African Americans, and even Black Latinos in the South, right? Because there is also one of the things I don't talk a lot about in this talk is that at the same time non-Black Latinos are attending a place like Duke, Black Latinos are going to Shaw University, they're going to HBCU. So there's a long history too of Black Latinos in the South, in addition to kind of trying to build a coalition with African Americans. So it's really complicated is the long form answer.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No, thank you for the question. I'm continuing to sort of think about it and try and wrap my brain around it.
Thanks. And Monique Laney, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Cecilia, this was a great talk, really, really fascinating. I live in Alabama, so
Oh, great.
of what you speak. I was wondering, so there are two things that I was reminded of. One is, have you seen, you probably have, it's a movie that came out, I think in 2009, Welcome to Shelbyville.
I haven't seen it, no.
Oh, you should watch that. It's a documentary. It's actually really interesting, well done, and it deals with Shelbyville, I guess that's Tennessee. And the like as new groups of immigrants come in, and it speaks very much to what you're talking about, like as new immigrants are coming in, how the community is reacting very differently, and all the different individuals that are trying to mitigate this. Anyway, it's fascinating. So definitely worthwhile, and it's right as also during the Obama election, right? So interesting stuff. Anyway, but on another note, I was just curious because, and you speak like a true historian, it's complicated, right?
Sorry.
That's what we say all the time. But I was wondering if you could help me understand, since I don't know that literature very well, where your book fits within the historiography around Latinos in the South, because there's obviously stuff already been written, right? So what is it that yours is right now? Like, where are you placing yourself there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say there isn't actually a lot written. I think like maybe before me, we have like 2 books. So it's pretty scarce actually. So we're still, some of it is like, we just haven't looked at some of these places at all. But I would say the big thing that I'm trying to think about is the relationship between Latinos and the category of Latino and Blackness. I think that a lot of the literature that looks at Latinos in the South hasn't sort of adequately dealt with the fundamental role that Blackness plays in structuring Latino racial identity, specifically in a place like the South. Because of the history of chattel slavery, because of the history of Reconstruction, the category of Latino is sort of perpetually defined either alongside or against that of Blackness. And so part of what I'm trying to do is really talk about how any Latino history of the South is an inherently segregated history. And so, I mean, if we take seriously the idea that there are, in fact, Black Latinos, then we can't tell a Latino history of the South that doesn't meaningfully reckon with Jim Crow, right? That doesn't meaningfully reckon with segregation and white supremacy, because a lot of the Latino histories of the South that we've been told before just don't meaningfully account for Black Latinos as a population, or the fact that non-Black Latinos are benefiting from white supremacy, frankly. And so that's sort of what I see my role is really thinking about Blackness and thinking about how Latino identity is understood through ideas about Blackness, African Americanness in particular. And how the evolution of Latino identity is also evolving in relation to Blackness, right? Hardworking Hispanics in the 1980s and 1990s is like right on the heels of the Reagan years and the welfare queen idea and all that stuff. Like, this is dog whistle politics. Hardworking Hispanics, unlike lazy African Americans, right? Like, that's the kind of the dog whistle that they're trying to say, and I'm trying to be explicit about that this is a category that's always defined in relation to Blackness from jump. And so I see that as sort of my big contribution. Yeah, I'd say that as my contribution. I also think I think a lot of the other work has looked at kind of like labor and labor migration, and I'm really interested in racial formation and how ideas about race change, which is to say that I think some of the other histories of the South take Latino as a category sort of for granted. It's like tracing the story of Latinos, and I'm like, let's trace the story of how we become Latino. Like, let's take that category and put it into motion and try and actually understand when and how that becomes a meaningful category for us. I mean, Latino we can have the debate about Latino. I don't mean Latino in particular, but Hispanic, kind of some kind of like coalitional racial identity. Or pan-ethnic racial identity. How do we get to that place, as opposed to taking for granted that Hispanic is a meaningful way of organizing human beings, which it frankly isn't in the South in the 1940s and 50s. There's no sense that there would be a kind of pan-ethnic identity of us at that time. There's just no reason to believe that. We don't have the same kinds of histories as California, Texas, Florida, et cetera. So really being critical about racial categories and how they emerge and how they change is the other thing I think I bring to the table.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments, feel free to jump in if you'd like to. I know that everyone is wrapping up their semester, quarter, exams, grading, all of the things. Jen.
Hi, Cecilia. I really appreciate your presentation. I've been looking forward to this. I'm an urban planner. I'm in Abigail's department at UCSD, and I actually study the South too, and Latinos in the South. And so I've been working on a long-term project that, based on my dissertation, that ended up having additional work, but looking at the effects of anti-immigration housing ordinances and these types of things, mostly in Georgia, on a largely Mexican population. I know it's bigger than that, but that's the group I focused on. And so it's got HB 87, 287G, all these things, right? But I guess one thing that has been on the back of my mind with anything I read dealing with Latinos in the South, historical or contemporary, is the second and third generation. I've purchased your book. I haven't had a chance to fully read it. So I'm curious where the second and third going that far back generation play, because I think this is a group in terms of advocacy and thinking of like the Georgia Human Rights Alliance and all these other groups that are doing really interesting work. And I think a lot of people outside of the South don't really understand the power of that generation. I mean, it's the reason why Georgia is purple, you know, in some years, right? You know, and anytime we kind of look at those types of things, I think we don't really give enough credit for that population. So historically, me not being a historian, I'd be curious on your take.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that question. And I'm excited to read your work. I also do want to just flag, I have a colleague at Emory. Her name is Yami Rodriguez, and she is writing a history of Mexican Atlanta. That might be
Yeah,
helpful.
I've seen her work. Yeah.
Oh yeah, she's dope. She's also like my person.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yes, okay, so a couple of thoughts. One thing that's interesting about Latino migration to the South is that at least the early generations are often second stop in the US migrants. So at a place like Dalton, because of IRCA, because so many folks relocate sort of post IRCA, a lot of folks who are getting to Dalton, for example, are from Chicago or they're from LA. They're not from Mexico. And so one of the things we notice in a lot of Southern places is that community development happens much quicker than you would expect for a kind of new migrant population. So things like soccer leagues, things like churches and restaurants, like those things pop up much quicker and become well established more quickly than we would expect in a kind of new immigrant population. And it's part because they're bringing with them lessons from more established immigrant communities or sort of ethnic communities in places like LA and Chicago. So I think even the first kind of generation is different than we might imagine other immigrant populations being, because many of them are from the US. The second kind of round of immigration is much more from sort of Mexico proper. And so yeah, I mean, I think this question of generation is so interesting and important because this idea that Latinos are constantly newcomers anywhere they go is something I'm also trying to kind of challenge and work against, because at this point we have people whose like grandkids are born in the South, right? Like we're talking multiple generations of folks who are like established in this region, that I think is so significant and important. And I will say, you know, I did research. I was in Birmingham at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, and I was working with some young people who were part of this immigrant rights organization. And one of the questions I would ask them when I was doing oral histories with them is like, do you consider yourself Southern? And the answers were super mixed. You know, like some of them were like, no, I don't drive a pickup truck. I hate country music. Of course I'm not Southern. Others were like, you know, of course I'm Southern. Like I'm born and raised in rural Alabama. Like, what are you talking about? You know, and it's like, what was interesting is like the same generation, right? Like most of their parents had come to the United States and settled in Birmingham, Alabama, or sort of on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama. And the same sort of part of the same age cohort were all answering really differently about their sense of themselves and their relationship to this region and this state. And so I think it's really interesting to see how I'm excited to see like folks like you, like social scientists, really take up this question of kind of how does assimilation work differently in a place like the South where you don't have really like robust or you don't have as big of ethnic communities as you might in a place like LA. But you have ethnic communities. Like you do have like, for those who don't know Atlanta, like Buford Highway is like a place that it's like tons of like East Asian, South Asian, Mexican, Central American population sort of all throughout there. It's the South is increasingly migrant. And so I will say, so sorry. So to say that what I mostly look at in my own work is kind of like the last chapter is really getting at that first generation born in the South. And those are young people who are kind of victims of this legislation that comes through. So they're dreamers or they have DACA or other kinds of young people who are trying to go to college but are unable to because either they are undocumented or they come from mixed status families and it's complicated. And so a lot of what I look at is like the activism of this population whose parents were actively recruited here, which I think is such an important thing to keep going back to, that like these folks didn't just like show up in the South because they loved the weather, right? It's like actively being recruited to this region. And so it's the sort of the children of that population, of that first round population, that are starting to do the activist work, really, who are starting to be the kind of foot soldiers of these really early Latino social service organizations like Galahar and here we have El Centro. There's like all these different social service orgs, but they're really, some of them are citizens, and I think they're really using that citizenship as a way to be more bold than their parents could be. There's a great documentary for those who haven't seen it called The Unafraid, which is about Georgia, undocumented students in Georgia, trying to be able to access higher education and fighting to be able to do that. And specifically, they're all sort of kids of, I think they're all kids of immigrants. They are all undocumented themselves, but come from mixed status families, and trying to sort of, and they're like a group of sort of activist young people trying to make Georgia, I don't know, accessible to them in some meaningful way, and fight against, I think it was it HB 87 or HB 56? I get Alabama and Georgia's confused, but
87 in Georgia.
thank you. Sorry, it's 50, must be 56 in Alabama. Yeah, but I love this question. And I think that also I'm sort of fascinated too about your work, because one of the things that we also see with the history of Latinos in the South is about settlement and housing, which is that like early generations of migrants are often living in trailer parks on the kind of periphery of cities in some of these places. And then once they move into, and then sometimes in apartment complexes, but once they start to move more into this, like into areas like suburban and ex-urban areas, there's kind of pushback from specifically local white populations. But so the question of kind of housing and settlement is a really important and I think understudied one. So I'm excited. I'm amped about your work.
That's my book. Yeah, that's what I'm working on. But exactly that in suburban areas. Just a quick follow up to what you said. I was at University of Oregon right before here, UCSD, and Julie Weiss is there, and I know that you've been in contact with her. Just a follow-up, there's so many terms for everyone working on the South: New South, Nuevo South, Nuevo Latino South. I'm thinking of also like Perla Guerrero's work, right? And so I don't know if you've reconciled with that, because historians will always push back in a good way and say it's not new. And Julie Weiss would say this all the time, it's been like this for over 100 years. I don't know why people use the term new or nuevo, right? But for so many of us taking, different looks at this, it's newer in our disciplines too. So not so much in history.
Yeah, it is also new. I mean, I think I am very pro. I think there's some important, it's important that Latinos are not seen as new everywhere we go. I think that's important. And so I think the Nuevo South thing, the pushback has largely been like, again, we're not newcomers everywhere we go. It is also true that like if you take a place like Dalton, Georgia, or Atlanta, for example, if you look at Atlanta in 1972 and 1982, like it is a different place when you talk demographically about Latinos, and the city as a result. So I mean, I'm very empathetic and to social scientists who are framing it as new, because I think that they're not wrong in the sense that like somewhere like Dalton Public Schools, this is a place that had like no ESL, like no Spanish speaking population. All of a sudden, like half the school is Spanish speaking, monolingual Spanish speakers. For those teachers, this is a new South, like they didn't learn, this is like a totally new population, a new region for them. And so, I think that on the one hand, I think like what we do as historians is we're like, nothing is new. Everything has a history, and our context matters. And I stand by that. And I also don't want to pretend like we're not in a totally different world in a place like Atlanta. I mean, Atlanta is sort of interesting, and too because of the Olympics and how like pre and post Olympics, it's like a totally different world because of all the Latinos who came to build the Olympic city. So it's sort of like how I feel about the term Latino, which is like, I think I'm sort of like, whatever you want to call it is fine with me. Like there's good arguments in all directions. I don't use Nuevo South, but I'm also not, I also get why people do it. I just think that the big pushback is, again, not having us not be newcomers everywhere and forever and ever. Because to your point, how like this idea that we're newcomers, but also people are having their grandkids in North Carolina and their second gen, you know what I mean? And they've been there this whole time. it's like, okay, at some point we have to just be from the South, and like the South has to be, it has to be okay that Latinos are Southern and that the South has Latinos in that. This can't be for forever a kind of paradox, you know? So yes, I think it's a really important, and productive conversation. I've also been with Julie and Perla on panels with those social scientists. And I think that we all kind of are on the same page, that it's like, there's the terms that we use because they're valuable and catchy and interesting and capture something. And then there's the kind of actual research that we do, which I think reflects something much more complicated.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. This is, it's just fantastic to hear about your work. I'm looking forward to your next project, which you already have dropped some nice appealing things about. And I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But we really appreciate your taking the time to speak to us, and just wanted to let folks know in the chat, there's a link to look at our upcoming seminars. We'll be having Ulrika Bialas on January 10th, talking about her book, Forever 17, Coming of Age in the German Asylum System. And then on January 31st, we'll have Ragini Shah, who's a law professor, talking about constructed movements, extraction and resistance in Mexican migrant communities. Thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful holiday and great to see you.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.